In 1863, America faced a paradox. To build a railroad across the continent, every mile of iron and timber first had to be hauled by ship, wagon, or river into the wilderness, decades before forklifts or highways existed. Yet somehow, using little more than hand tools and human strength, 1,900 miles of track stitched the country together. Before the first spike was swung, the true challenge was not engineering. It was how to deliver millions of pounds of materials into nowhere. So how did they solve this impossible supply chain? And what did it really cost? Iron rails began their journey in the roaring mills of Pennsylvania and New Jersey, where foundries like Cambria Iron Company forged thousands of tons each month. Each rail, weighing about 56 pounds per yard, was cast, cooled, and loaded onto ships in eastern ports, New York, Philadelphia, Boston. From there, the rails traveled more than 18,000 miles by sea, either around the storm-lashed tip of Cape Horn or by steamship to Panama, then across the isthmus by rail, before another ship carried them up the Pacific coast. The trip could take up to 6 months, with entire shipments lost to shipwrecks or delays. Meanwhile, in the high Sierra Nevada, lumber crews felled ancient pine and fir, cutting millions of timber ties, each about 8 feet long and weighing over 200 pounds. These ties were stacked in rough piles, hauled by ox teams and sledges down mountain slopes, then floated on rivers or dragged by wagon to makeshift depots. Every mile of track required about 2,500 ties, so the forests echoed with axes and saws day and night. Locomotives, spikes, and even barrels of black powder followed similar routes. Central Pacific's engines arrived in pieces, boxed and numbered, then reassembled in Sacramento after their ocean voyage. Kegs of blasting powder came from both eastern factories and, after 1864, the California Powder Works near Santa Cruz. Before a single rail was laid, this supply chain had to deliver more than 177,000 tons of iron and millions of wooden ties into places with no roads, no towns, and no infrastructure. Materials piled up in Sacramento and Omaha, waiting for the next leap forward. The railroad's first miles were built not on dreams, but on the relentless movement of raw materials, hauled by ship, by river, and by muscle into the heart of a continent that had never seen such a flow of iron and timber. Iron and timber could be stacked in depots, but getting them to the advancing edge of the railroad posed a riddle that seemed almost unsolvable. Before the first locomotive ever steamed across the plains, every single rail, spike, and tie had to be hauled by the very wagons and riverboats the railroad was meant to replace. Missouri River steamers churned upstream for 1,000 miles, their decks groaning under the weight of rails and machinery. At Omaha, the cargo was unloaded onto the open prairie, where teams of oxen, sometimes hundreds at a time, waited to drag the loads west. A single freight wagon, pulled by 6 or 8 oxen, could carry 3 tons on a good day, but the distances were staggering. Early railheads might be just 50 miles from the river, but as track pushed west, the gap grew to hundreds of miles. Wagon trains stretched for a mile or more, each train a moving lifeline of iron, wood, powder, and food. A caravan of 50 wagons could haul enough rail for just 5 miles of track, and making the round trip could take a month. Mud, swollen rivers, and sudden storms turned the journey into a gamble, with losses from breakdowns, stampedes, or raids a constant threat. Freight contractors like Russell, Majors, and Waddell, veterans of Army supply lines, managed the chaos with a mix of military discipline and sheer nerve. Depot managers counted every shipment, knowing a single missing load could halt progress for weeks. Temporary supply depots dotted the route, each one a fragile outpost where piles of rails and ties waited for the next leap forward. Every mile of new track shortened the supply run. But until rails reached the next depot, the paradox remained. The railroad's future depended on the slow, grinding movement of wagons and riverboats, technology on the brink of its own extinction, struggling to deliver the means of its replacement. Before any locomotive could roll forward, the land itself had to be shaped by hand. Survey parties moved ahead of the supply lines, carrying only notebooks, compasses, and long steel chains. Chief engineers like Grenville Dodge and his chainmen scouted every mile, measuring the world in 66-foot increments. Their calculations determined whether a route would hug a riverbank, cross a mountain pass, or risk the deep snows of the Sierra. A single wrong estimate could mean weeks of wasted labor or disaster when the spring floods arrived. To turn these lines on a map into an actual railroad bed, crews relied on simple machines scaled up to a monumental task. Horse-drawn scrapers called Fresnos bit into the earth, peeling away soil one thin layer at a time. Wheelbarrows lined up in columns, each one filled and dumped by hand day after day. In total, workers moved an estimated 20 million cubic yards of earth, enough to fill thousands of modern dump trucks, without the help of steam shovels or powered graders. Grading crews worked in a kind of mechanical ballet. As one team leveled the ground, another followed, laying ties and rails with practiced rhythm. Each instrument was basic: a hand-cranked drill, a sledgehammer, a crowbar. Yet in the hands of thousands, these tools transformed forests, plains, and mountains into a continuous path of iron. The surveyor's choices, where to cut, where to fill, how steep a grade to allow, set the stage for every challenge that followed. A misjudged slope could mean runaway trains or deadly rock slides years later. Every decision, every mark in a surveyor's notebook rippled forward through the entire project. The railroad's path was not dictated by machines, but by the eyes, hands, and judgment of the people who walked it first. In the heart of the Sierra Nevada, work stopped being a matter of muscle and became a test of survival. The mountains stood in the way, their granite faces refusing to yield. Tunnel crews started each day with a hammer and a chisel, driving steel into stone by hand. To carve a single blast hole, a team of 2 or 3 men took turns swinging heavy sledges, striking the drill as it twisted deeper, inch by inch. Progress was measured in feet per week. Black powder packed into these holes was the only force strong enough to break the rock. When the fuse was lit, men scattered for cover, bracing for the thunder that would shake the mountain. But black powder was slow and unpredictable. Some blasts barely cracked the surface. Others sent shards flying, injuring or killing anyone too close. In 1866, the Central Pacific tried something new: nitroglycerin. This clear, oily liquid was 10 times more powerful than powder and far more dangerous. Workers mixed it on site, hauling acids and glycerin up winding wagon roads to makeshift sheds perched above the tunnels. There was no margin for error. One explosion at Summit Tunnel killed at least 5 men, their names lost to the payroll ledgers. After that, nitroglycerin use was sharply limited. Most crews went back to black powder, accepting the slow grind and the risk. Winter brought a different kind of threat. Storms buried the camps in snow, sometimes 20 feet deep. Tunnels filled with ice, and the air inside dropped below freezing. Work halted for months at a time. The only way to keep men alive was to dig passageways through the drifts, haul supplies by sled, and wait for the thaw. For those trapped by the weather, every day was a battle just to endure. The mountain would not be rushed, and every foot of tunnel was paid for in blood, frostbite, and lost time. Chinese laborers made up the backbone of the Central Pacific's workforce, numbering as many as 12,000 at the project's height. Most earned about $30 a month, paid in coin, but with deductions for food, tools, and supplies bought from company stores. White workers, by comparison, earned closer to $35 and were often given board. The pay gap was only the start. Chinese crews took on the most dangerous jobs, hanging from ropes to blast rock faces, tunneling through granite, and shoveling snow from buried tracks. Their names rarely appeared on payroll sheets, and they were often recorded only as anonymous groups led by a single foreman. Daily life in the camps meant 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, from dawn until dusk. At night, the tent towns came alive with the clatter of blacksmiths sharpening tools, the aroma of rice and dried fish simmering over campfires, and the low voices of men writing letters home. Sunday, the only day off, was reserved for rest and laundry, or for tending small gardens carved out of the rocky soil. Survival depended on mutual aid. Workers pooled wages, shared food, and organized through tongs and family networks. Yet even with this solidarity, the threat of injury, illness, or eviction hung over every camp. Farther east, Irish immigrants and Civil War veterans filled Union Pacific's ranks, facing their own share of hardship and violence. But the railroad's advance brought more than just laborers. Each mile of new track cut deeper into tribal homelands. Shoshone, Paiute, Cheyenne, and Lakota families watched as tent cities and supply trains carved up ancient hunting grounds. Buffalo herds, once numbering in the millions, dwindled as hunters shot them from passing trains or slaughtered them for hides to ship east. Tribal historians trace the loss of land and game directly to the railroad's arrival, mapping a line of dispossession that stretched from the Sierra foothills to the open plains. The cost was measured not just in dollars or miles, but in uprooted lives and vanished worlds. Telegraph wires trailed the advancing rails, strung hastily on poles hammered into raw earth. But the line was never more than a few days ahead of the track, and sometimes it lagged far behind. Where the wire ran out, messages traveled by horseback, handed from rider to rider across muddy rivers and wind-blown plains. Orders for supplies or new crews could take days to reach the front. A missed message meant a grading crew might arrive to find another team already working the same ground. Hundreds of men duplicating effort, burning precious time and money. One spring morning in 1867, a Union Pacific foreman in Nebraska waited for word on where to push his graders next. The telegraph line had snapped in a thunderstorm 2 nights before, and the repair crew was still miles away. By the time the message finally arrived, delivered by a dust-covered courier on a lathered horse, another crew had already started work on the same stretch. 2 weeks of labor, wasted. Wire crews raced to keep up, splicing and stringing new lines as fast as the track layers advanced. But every gap in the telegraph turned routine decisions into games of chance. Foremen gambled on rumors and messengers galloped through the night, hoping to catch the right man before plans changed again. This fragile network was all that linked the two halves of the railroad. Missteps meant lost wages, idle workers, and missed deadlines, each one a threat to the company's race for government money and the promise of a continent finally joined. Government money fueled the race west, but it was not a flat payout. The Pacific Railway Act set up a ladder of rewards and land. For every mile of track completed, the companies received federal bonds, $16,000 per mile across flat prairie, $32,000 per mile for foothills, and $48,000 per mile in the mountains. Land grants sweetened the deal. 10 square miles of public land for every mile of rail, later doubled to 20 square miles. The more miles built, the more money and land flowed into company coffers. Executives like Thomas Durant at Union Pacific and Collis Huntington at Central Pacific saw the arithmetic clearly. Every day lost was a fortune left on the table. Every mile gained meant another stack of government bonds and another claim to land that could be sold or mortgaged. This system did not reward careful engineering or safe construction. It rewarded speed. Crews rushed to lay track as fast as possible, sometimes doubling back to redo mistakes or racing past unfinished bridges. Inspectors certified finished sections, unlocking the next wave of bonds. The companies borrowed against future payouts, plunging deeper into debt to outpace each other. At the height of construction, Central Pacific laid 10 miles of track in a single day, a record that still stands. The stakes were enormous. Whoever built faster claimed more land, more money, and more power. The railroad was not just a line on a map, it was a financial contest, driven by a system where every spike hammered into the ground meant another government check and another acre of the West in private hands. At Promontory Summit, Utah, on May 10, 1869, two locomotives faced each other across a gap just wide enough for the final rail. Crowds gathered under a high desert sky, including railroad executives, politicians, workmen, and a handful of reporters. The last tie was made of polished California laurel, drilled to hold 4 ceremonial spikes, one of gold from California, one of silver from Nevada, and 2 more from Arizona. Leland Stanford, president of Central Pacific, stepped forward with a silver hammer as dignitaries pressed close. The moment was heavy with 6 years of labor and loss. Chinese workers who had laid the last rail just minutes before stood at a distance, their names unrecorded in the official program. Union Pacific's Irish track layers mingled with company bosses, all eyes on the gleaming spike. Stanford raised the hammer and brought it down. He missed on the first swing, striking the tie instead of the spike, a small human error in a ceremony meant to symbolize perfection. On the second try, the gold spike was tapped into place. In a telegraph car beside the tracks, operator William N. Bell waited, his hand poised over the key. Wires ran from the spike and hammer to his table, so each blow would send a signal east. When the final strike landed, Bell tapped out a single word: "Done." Across the country, crowds packed telegraph offices, waiting for that signal. Church bells rang in New York, cannons fired in San Francisco, and a message flashed coast to coast in seconds, an entire continent joined by a line of iron, finished by hand. The race was over, but the echoes of that day would carry far beyond the cheers and the gold. Steel and sweat once stitched a nation together without machines or modern safety. Today, we still depend on overlooked labor and invisible hands to build what we call progress. As new infrastructures rise, the question remains: how much human cost hides behind every mile? The tracks we lay now will define what unites or divides us next. Let me know what you think in the comments below.